I spent 41 years working for the National Park Service, and in that time, I've filed more missing persons reports than I can count. But it wasn't the disappearances that drove me out. It was what I found when I started reading them together. My name is Dale Whitfield. I started as a seasonal ranger at Olympic National Park in 1961, fresh out of the University of Washington with a degree in forestry and a belief that the wilderness was simply a place where trees grew and animals lived. By the time I retired in 2002, I understood that belief was dangerously incomplete. What I'm about to tell you took me decades to piece together, and I want to be clear about something before I start. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the same information I looked at and tell me what else it could possibly mean. In the winter of 1996, my daughter-in-law gave me a computer for Christmas. She said it would help me organize my fishing photos. Instead, I used it to organize something else entirely. I had boxes in my garage, 35 years of personal copies, field notes, incident reports, and correspondence with other rangers across the Pacific Northwest. Things I'd kept because something about them bothered me. Things that didn't quite add up when you read them in isolation, but when you laid them side by side, when you arranged them chronologically and mapped them geographically, a pattern emerged that made the hair on my forearms stand straight up. Every single disappearance I could verify in the parks and national forests of Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Idaho, and Montana between 1961 and 1998, where the missing person was never found, where no body was ever recovered, where the case simply went cold. Every single one of those cases had a Bigfoot sighting reported within 5 miles and within 72 hours of the disappearance. Every one. Now hold on. Before your mind jumps where I know it wants to jump, you need to understand something. The pattern doesn't suggest what you think it suggests. It suggests something far stranger, far more unsettling, and ultimately far more heartbreaking than a predator hunting people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to 1961. I was 22 years old, standing at the Hoh Rainforest Ranger Station on my first day, wearing boots that were too new and carrying a confidence that was entirely unjustified. My supervisor was a man named George Tilton. George had been with the Park Service since 1947. He was built like a cedar stump, short and impossibly wide, with hands that could palm a basketball and a voice that never rose above a conversational murmur, regardless of how angry he was. George took one look at me and said, "College boy, you'll either quit in 6 months or you'll be here when they carry you out." He was nearly right about the second part. George taught me everything the university hadn't. How to read weather by watching the way moss dried on the north side of big-leaf maples. How to estimate a black bear's weight by the depth of its track in different soil types. How to find a lost hiker by thinking like water, following the path of least resistance downhill. But there was one lesson George waited 3 full months to teach me, and he did it on a night I'll never forget as long as I draw breath. It was September of '61. We'd gotten a report from a backpacker who came stumbling into the ranger station at the Queets River trailhead, white as printer paper and shaking so hard he could barely hold the cup of coffee George handed him. His name was Alan Briggs. He was a math teacher from Tacoma, mid-30s, experienced outdoorsman, the kind of guy who packed his gear with military precision and could identify every bird in the Olympic range by call alone. Alan said he'd been camped at the 17-mile mark on the Queets River Trail when he heard something moving through the forest around 2 in the morning. He said it sounded like a person walking, but the stride was too long. The interval between footfalls was nearly double what a tall man would produce, and then he smelled it. Alan described it as a combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something chemical, almost like ammonia, but organic. He unzipped his tent and pointed his flashlight into the trees and saw, about 40 yards out, a figure standing upright between two Sitka spruce. It was massive. Alan estimated 7.5 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, and it was looking directly at him, not threatening, not advancing, just standing there, watching him with what Alan described as an expression of concern. That word stuck with me. Not aggression, not predatory focus, concern. Alan packed up his camp in what he said was the fastest 7 minutes of his life and hiked out in the dark. He was an experienced enough woodsman that he could follow the trail by moonlight and feel, and he made it to the trailhead by dawn. George listened to the whole story without interrupting, thanked Alan, made notes in his field journal, and then drove the man to the nearest hotel. When George came back, I expected him to laugh about it, to chalk it up to a bear sighting in bad light or a stressed hiker's imagination. Instead, George sat down at his desk, pulled out a topographic map, and marked the location with a small red dot. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a map that was already covered in red dots. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked him. "Since '53, George said. "That's when the first one went missing on my watch." He told me about a 14-year-old Boy Scout named Tommy Price, who vanished during a troop camping trip in the Enchanted Valley in August of 1953. Tommy had gone to use the latrine at approximately 9:30 at night. The latrine was 70 yards from the main camp. Tommy never came back. The search lasted 11 days. They brought in dogs, helicopters, every available ranger in the region. They found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no remains. Tommy Price simply ceased to exist on the face of the earth on a warm August night in 1953. 3 days before Tommy disappeared, a fishing guide named Walt Denny reported seeing an enormous hair-covered bipedal figure crossing the Quinault River at a shallow point approximately 4 miles from the Enchanted Valley camp. Walt was a Korean War veteran, a man not prone to fantasy or exaggeration, and he filed an official report with the Park Service. That report was quietly filed and never referenced in the investigation into Tommy Price's disappearance. George knew about it because he'd taken the original report from Walt himself. "You're saying there's a connection?" I asked George that night in '61. "I'm saying there's a proximity," he corrected me. "Connections require evidence. Proximity requires attention. There's a difference, and the day you forget, that difference is the day you become unreliable." That distinction, that careful line between observation and conclusion, guided my work for the next 4 decades. I didn't set out to build a case for anything. I simply paid attention. Over the next several years, I transferred between stations. I spent time at Mount Rainier, at North Cascades, did a 3-year stint in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and eventually worked my way through assignments in Oregon's Crater Lake and Rogue River areas. Everywhere I went, I did the same thing. I listened to reports. I talked to hunters, loggers, tribal members, other rangers, and I kept my own maps. The red dots multiplied. In 1967, I was stationed at Mount Rainier when a 28-year-old graduate student named Karen Webb went missing on the Wonderland Trail. She was studying alpine wildflower ecology, hiking alone, experienced and well-equipped. She checked in at the White River Ranger Station on a Tuesday morning, happy and healthy, and was never seen again. The search was extensive. National Guard, volunteer teams, tracking dogs, nothing. Karen Webb disappeared as completely as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. 48 hours before Karen vanished, a maintenance crew working on the road to Sunrise Point reported seeing what they described as a large, dark, man-shaped figure moving through a meadow at approximately 6 in the morning. The crew consisted of 4 men. All 4 saw it. All 4 filed statements. All 4 statements were consistent in their description. Dark brown or black hair, estimated height between 7 and 8 feet, bipedal locomotion, and a speed of movement that one crew member described as faster than any person he'd ever seen run, despite the figure appearing to simply be walking. I requested copies of those statements. They were already in a sealed file with a classification I'd never seen before. My request was denied by someone 3 levels above my direct supervisor. That denial was the first time I understood that whatever pattern I was tracking, someone else was tracking it too, and they didn't want it found. In 1971, I was in the Gifford Pinchot when a husband and wife from Portland went missing near the Indian Heaven Wilderness, Steve and Donna Crawford. They were 45 and 42, respectively. Avid backpackers. Their car was found at the trailhead with their dog inside, windows cracked, a bowl of water on the back seat. The dog was frantic but unharmed. The Crawfords were never found. 6 days before their disappearance, a timber survey crew in the same area reported finding a series of footprints in a muddy creek bed. The prints measured 17¼ inches long and approximately 7 inches wide. The stride between them was over 4 feet. A Forest Service biologist was brought in to examine them. He cast 3 of the prints in plaster. I saw those casts. They showed dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints, running across the sole in a pattern consistent with primate anatomy but not matching any known species. Those casts were confiscated by someone from the regional office within a week. The biologist who made them, a man named Frank Moore, was transferred to a desk position in D.C. within a month. I called Frank once, about 5 years later. He said 2 words before hanging up. "Don't call." He sounded scared. By the mid-1970s, I had documented 17 cases where a disappearance in the Pacific Northwest wilderness was preceded by a Bigfoot sighting in close temporal and geographic proximity. 17 cases. I kept everything in a lockbox in my garage. Copies of reports, my own field notes, maps with dates and coordinates. My wife, Carol, thought I was losing my mind. She wasn't entirely wrong. The pattern was eating at me because I couldn't explain it, and every explanation I could imagine was worse than the last. Were these creatures hunting people? The evidence said no. In every sighting report, the behavior described was observational, not predatory. Watchers at a distance, figures that withdrew when spotted, sounds in the night that circled but never closed in. If these were predators, they were the most inefficient predators in evolutionary history. Thousands of people hiked through these forests every year, and the disappearance rate, while horrifying to the families involved, was statistically tiny. Were the sightings coincidental? That was easier to believe, but the math didn't support it. I wasn't a statistician, so in 1978, I did something that nearly ended my career. I contacted Dr. Richard Wells at the University of Oregon's Statistics Department. I presented my data without telling him what it represented. I just gave him 2 sets of coordinates and dates, labeled as Event A and Event B, and asked him to determine whether the correlation was statistically significant. Richard ran the numbers and called me back within a week. "Where did you get this data?" he asked me. His voice was careful, controlled, the way people speak when they're trying not to reveal how alarmed they are. "Field research," I told him. "Dale, the correlation coefficient is 0.97. For reference, anything above 0.7 is considered strong. Anything above 0.9 is considered very strong. 0.97 is essentially 1-to-1. Whatever event A is, event B follows it with near-perfect reliability. This isn't coincidence. This is causation or co-occurrence with a shared triggering variable." "What are these events?" I told him. There was a long silence on the line. "I can't be involved in this," Richard said. "But you need to understand what you have. If your data is accurate, and if event A is genuinely what you're describing, then one of two things is happening. Either event A is causing event B, or both events are being caused by something else that you haven't identified yet. Either way, this is significant. He sent me the analysis. I put it in the lockbox, and I kept watching. The 1980s were when things accelerated, both in terms of the disappearances and in terms of my understanding of what was actually happening. In 1982, I was assigned to a joint task force investigating a cluster of 3 disappearances in the North Cascades over a single summer. 3 people, unrelated, vanishing from different locations within a 40-square-mile area over a period of 11 weeks. A 19-year-old trail crew volunteer named Mike Stanton in June, a 57-year-old birdwatcher named Helen Young in July, and a 33-year-old Forest Service cartographer named Jim Davis in August. The task force was unusual. It included Park Service rangers, Forest Service personnel, 2 FBI agents, and a man who was introduced to us only as Dr. Cole, with no first name and no agency affiliation. Dr. Cole asked questions that nobody else was asking. He wanted to know about animal behavior in the weeks before each disappearance. Had there been unusual bird patterns? Had any rangers noticed changes in deer or elk movement? Were there reports of prolonged silence in the forest, the phenomenon that experienced outdoorsmen call the quiet, where all ambient wildlife sound simply stops? The answers were yes. In all 3 cases, rangers and hikers in the area had reported unusual animal behavior in the days preceding the disappearances. Elk herds moving to lower elevations, weeks ahead of their normal migration schedule. Ravens congregating in numbers that one ranger described as biblical. And the quiet. Multiple reports of extended periods of absolute silence in forests that should have been alive with birdsong, insect activity, and small mammal movement. Dr. Cole took notes in a small leather journal. He asked to see my maps. I don't know how he knew I had them, and that question still bothers me. I showed him what I had, 30-plus cases at that point, spread across 2 decades and 6 states. He studied them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and said something that I have turned over in my mind every single day since. Ranger Whitfield, these creatures aren't causing the disappearances. They're responding to them. They know it's going to happen before it does, and they come to watch. The question you should be asking isn't why they're near the disappearances, it's how they know. I asked him what he meant. He closed his journal and said, "There are places in these forests where the boundary between what we understand and what we don't becomes very, very thin. The creatures you're tracking, they seem to perceive those boundaries. They gather at them the way animals gather at a watering hole, not to cause anything, to witness it, perhaps to warn. We've documented cases where their presence appears to be protective, where the sightings occur and no one disappears. We believe they're trying to prevent it, and we believe they're failing." Dr. Cole left the task force 3 days later. I never saw him again. I tried to find him through every channel I had access to. No agency had a record of a Dr. Cole matching his description. The 2 FBI agents on the task force told me, separately and in almost identical words, that they had never heard of him and that I should stop asking. But his words rearranged everything I thought I understood. I went back to my data. I went back to every case. And I started looking not just at the disappearances that happened after sightings, but at the sightings that happened without subsequent disappearances. The results were staggering. For every disappearance-linked sighting, there were approximately 4 sightings in the same areas during the same time windows, where no one went missing. 4 to 1. And when I mapped those non-disappearance sightings, they clustered along the same trail segments, the same creek crossings, the same ridge lines where people later vanished. The creatures were patrolling, that's the only word that fits. They were moving through these areas repeatedly, consistently, and the disappearances happened when they weren't there, not when they were. Let me say that again because it's the most important thing I'll tell you today. People disappeared in the gaps, in the windows when the sightings stopped. When whatever was being watched, whatever was being guarded was left unattended, that's when people vanished. The implication turned everything upside down. These weren't predators circling prey, they were sentinels, and they were losing. In 1985, I had an experience that transformed this from an academic exercise into something deeply personal. I was conducting a solo patrol in a remote section of the Olympic backcountry, an area called the El Hua headwaters that even most rangers avoided because of the difficulty of access. I was checking on a weather station that had stopped transmitting data, a routine maintenance task that required a 12-mile hike through some of the densest old-growth forest remaining in the lower 48 states. It was October. The rain had been steady for 3 days, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that doesn't fall so much as it simply exists everywhere simultaneously, turning the air itself into something you breathe through rather than walk through. The trail, such as it was, followed an old elk path along the river. The forest was Sitka spruce and western red cedar, trees that were 500 and 600 years old, trunks wider than my truck, canopy so dense that even at midday, the light on the forest floor was the blue-green of deep water. I reached the weather station around 2 in the afternoon and found the problem immediately. A branch had fallen across the solar panel, easy fix. But as I was clearing the debris, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were tracks in the mud around the base of the station, not animal tracks, not boot prints, bare footprints, humanoid in shape, but enormous, 18 inches long at minimum, and they were everywhere, dozens of them, circling the station, approaching it from multiple angles, some of them overlapping in ways that suggested more than one individual. I stood there in the rain looking at those prints, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades of wilderness work. I felt watched, not threatened. Watched. The way you feel when someone in a crowd is staring at the back of your head and you turn around and catch their eyes before they look away. That exact sensation, but multiplied by the silence of the forest. I looked up from the tracks and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The rain fell. The river murmured. But the forest was quiet. No birds, no squirrels, no insects, just the rain and the river and the overwhelming feeling that I was standing in the middle of something I didn't understand. Then I heard it, a sound I've heard described in hundreds of reports, but had never experienced myself. A vocalization. It came from the slope above me, maybe 200 yards uphill, filtered through the trees and the rain. It was low-pitched, resonant, almost subsonic. I felt it in my chest before I heard it with my ears. It wasn't a howl or a scream or any of the dramatic sounds you hear in documentaries. It was more like a hum, a sustained, complex tone that rose and fell in pitch in a way that felt deliberate, structured, like speech slowed down to a frequency that human ears could barely register. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then another one answered from across the river. Same tonal quality, different pattern. Then a third from further north, higher on the ridge. They were communicating. 3 distinct sources triangulated around my position, exchanging information in a vocal system that was clearly sophisticated enough to carry meaning across distance and terrain. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it matters. I was not afraid. I was 46 years old. I had worked in grizzly country, cougar country, and places where one wrong step meant a fall that would kill you before you hit the ground. I knew fear. This wasn't fear, this was awe. The awe of standing in the presence of something that operates on a level of intelligence and organization that we have refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require us to rethink everything we believe about what shares this continent with us. I stood perfectly still and listened. The vocalizations continued for perhaps 10 minutes. 3 voices, sometimes overlapping, sometimes in sequence, varying in pitch and duration and complexity. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a 4th voice, much higher in pitch, almost like a child. It came from the direction of the river, below me, close, maybe 50 yards. I turned slowly toward the sound. The brush along the riverbank was thick, a wall of salmonberry and devil's club that would have been impenetrable to anything smaller than an elk. But something was moving in it. I could see the tops of the bushes swaying in a line that tracked movement from my left to my right. The movement was smooth, deliberate, and whatever was causing it was tall enough to push through chest-high brush without apparent effort. It stopped moving directly across from me, maybe 40 yards away, separated by the brush and the narrow gravel bar at the river's edge. The high-pitched vocalization came again, closer, and from up the hill one of the deeper voices responded, a single short tone, almost like a word, almost like "come back." The brush shook once, and then the movement reversed, heading uphill, away from me, toward the deeper voice. Within minutes, the forest was empty. The quiet persisted for another 20 minutes, and then, like someone slowly turning up the volume on a radio, the birds started again. A winter wren, a varied thrush, the tapping of a pileated woodpecker somewhere in the canopy. The forest exhaled, and I realized I'd been holding my entire body rigid, not out of terror, but out of the desire to not disturb what I was witnessing. I spent the next hour documenting every footprint I could find. I measured them with my tape measure. I photographed them with the disposable camera I carried for equipment documentation. I mapped their positions relative to the weather station, the river, and the approximate locations of the vocalizations. When I hiked out that evening, I did something I'd never done in 24 years of service. I didn't file an official report. I wrote everything down in my personal notes and put the film canister in the lockbox in my garage. Because by 1985, I understood something that younger me wouldn't have believed. Filing that report wouldn't lead to investigation. It would lead to confiscation, just like Frank Moore's plaster casts, just like the sealed files at Rainier, just like Dr. Cole, who appeared from nowhere and disappeared back into it. The system wasn't designed to investigate this phenomenon. It was designed to manage it, and managing it meant keeping it quiet. But here's what I couldn't keep quiet, not to myself, not in the privacy of my own mind as I drove home through the rain on Highway 101 that October evening. Those vocalizations I heard, that exchange between 3 or 4 individuals, one of them young, were not the sounds of animals. Animals don't triangulate communication across terrain. Animals don't call a young one back from approaching a human with a single short tone that the young one immediately obeys. Animals don't patrol a grid pattern around a piece of human infrastructure. What I witnessed was behavior consistent with organized, cooperative intelligence operating with social structure, communication, and what I can only describe as a protective mandate toward the landscape they inhabited, and they were trying to protect us too. That's what Dr. Cole understood. That's what the data showed. The pattern wasn't predator and prey. The pattern was guardian and failure. Something was happening in those forests, something that caused people to vanish without any physical trace. And these creatures knew where and roughly when it would happen, and they tried to be there when it did. When they succeeded, the sighting was just a sighting, a scared hiker, a strange story told over campfire coffee. When they failed, when the patrol had a gap, when the grid wasn't covered, someone walked into one of those thin places and didn't come back. Between 1986 and 1990, 5 more people disappeared in my region under circumstances that matched the pattern. Every case, no exceptions, sighting within 72 hours and 5 miles, followed by a disappearance, always in a gap between sighting clusters, always in a place where the patrol had been present before and after, but not during. In 1988, I started corresponding with other rangers, carefully, obliquely. I couldn't come out and say what I was tracking because that would have ended my career. Instead, I wrote letters. This was before email was common in the Park Service, so these were actual physical letters. I wrote to rangers I knew personally at Glacier National Park in Montana, at the Sawtooth Wilderness in Idaho, at Klamath National Forest in Northern California. I asked simple questions. Had they noticed any correlation between unusual wildlife reports and missing persons cases in their areas? Did they keep personal notes on unexplained incidents? The responses astonished me. 7 out of 11 rangers I contacted wrote back with some version of the same answer. Yes, they had noticed. Some of them had been tracking it for years. One ranger at Glacier, a man named Tom Green, who'd been there since 1969, had his own collection of maps and notes that paralleled mine almost exactly. His data covered Montana and the Idaho Panhandle. When we compared maps, the pattern held. Sightings preceded disappearances with the same statistical reliability. The correlation was consistent across geographic regions, spanning hundreds of miles. Tom and I began collaborating quietly. We established a private mail drop, a post office box in a small town on the Oregon-Washington border, and used it to exchange information that we didn't trust to the Park Service mail system. Over the next 4 years, we built a combined dataset of 63 cases spanning nearly 4 decades and covering an area from the Canadian border to the California-Oregon line. The correlation held at 0.95, not quite as tight as my original Pacific Northwest data, but well within the range of statistical significance. Whatever was happening, it wasn't local, it was regional, it was consistent, and it had been going on for as long as anyone had been paying attention. In 1991, Tom called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice was different, tight, controlled in a way that I recognized from my own experience as the sound of a man trying to stay rational in the face of something that made rationality feel like a small and inadequate tool. "Dale," he said, "I just got back from the North Fork of the Flathead. I need to tell you what I found." Tom had gone in to investigate a sighting report from a backcountry ranger, a woman named Lisa Scott, who'd been stationed at a remote fire lookout for the summer. Lisa reported that for 3 consecutive nights, she'd heard vocalizations from the valley below her lookout, the same type I'd heard in '85, low, resonant, structured tones exchanged between multiple sources. On the 3rd night, she'd used her binoculars in the moonlight and seen movement on the valley floor, multiple large, dark figures moving through a meadow in what she described as a formation, not random, organized, like a search party. Tom hiked into Lisa's lookout and spent 2 nights there himself. On the 2nd night, he heard the vocalizations, but he heard something else too, something Lisa hadn't reported because it happened after Tom arrived. From the same valley where the figures had been moving, Tom heard a sound that he described to me as the worst thing he'd ever heard in his life. A tearing sound. Not organic, not mechanical. He said it was like the sound of fabric ripping, if the fabric were made of air itself. It lasted about 3 seconds, and when it stopped, the vocalizations exploded in volume and urgency, every voice at once, overlapping, frantic, a wall of sound that Tom said vibrated the windows of the lookout. Then silence, total silence, for the rest of the night. The next morning, Tom hiked down to the meadow. He found the tracks, dozens of them, the same enormous humanoid prints. And he found something else, a circle in the meadow grass, approximately 20 feet in diameter, where the grass was not just flattened but absent, not burned, not torn up, simply gone. Bare earth in a perfect circle, surrounded by tall grass that showed no signs of transition. The grass just stopped at a precise line, and there was dirt inside that line. Clean, dry, undisturbed dirt, as if the grass had never been there. Tom photographed everything. He measured the circle. He collected soil samples, and at the edge of the circle, pressed deep into the soft earth, he found a single human boot print. Size 9. The tread pattern was consistent with a popular hiking boot manufactured by a company out of Portland. The boot print pointed toward the center of the circle. There was no corresponding print leading away. Someone had walked into that circle and not walked out. Tom cross-referenced the date with missing persons reports. A solo hiker named Kevin Clark, age 41, had failed to return from a day hike in the same general area. His car was found at a trailhead 7 miles from the meadow. Kevin Clark was never found. He was wearing, according to his wife, a pair of size 9 hiking boots, purchased that spring from a retailer in Missoula. That was the moment the pattern stopped being statistical and became physical, tangible. A boot print pointing into a circle of impossible absence, surrounded by the tracks of creatures that had apparently tried to prevent exactly what had happened. Tom and I met in person for the first time a month after his discovery at the North Fork. We sat in a diner in Sandpoint, Idaho, a place chosen specifically because neither of us had any professional connections there. We spread his photographs across the table between plates of chicken fried steak and cups of coffee that went cold while we talked for 4 hours. The circle photographs were clear. The detail was undeniable. Whatever made that circle had removed vegetation and topsoil in a perfectly defined geometric shape, leaving behind the earth that looked almost polished, smooth, not scraped or excavated, more like what was above it had simply been lifted away. The footprint at the edge was equally clear. A man's boot pressed into soft ground with the weight of someone in mid-stride, pointing inward, and around the perimeter, at distances of 10 to 30 feet, the massive humanoid prints, some of them deep enough to suggest enormous weight, all of them oriented toward the circle, facing it, surrounding it. They were watching it happen, Tom said. They were right there and they couldn't stop it. Or they stopped it from being worse, I said. How many hikers were in that valley that week? Tom checked his notes. At least a dozen that I know of from trail registers. Only Kevin Clark went missing. We sat with that for a long time. 12 people in the area. 1 vanishes. And the creatures were there in numbers, patrolling, vocalizing, maintaining what seemed to be a perimeter. The question Dr. Cole had raised years earlier came back to me with new force. How did they know? What allowed them to perceive a danger that was invisible to us? And what were these circles, these precise geometric absences that appeared in locations where people walked in and didn't walk out? I need to pause here and address something that I know is building in your mind. You're wondering if I've lost my grip on reality, if decades of isolation and obsession have led an old ranger down a path of confirmation bias and pattern-seeking delusion. I wondered the same thing. Frequently, especially late at night, when the lockbox in the garage felt less like a repository of evidence and more like a monument to a breakdown in progress. So let me give you the counter-argument I gave myself. I tested the pattern against control data. I took the same time period, the same geographic region, and looked at disappearances that did have explanations. People who fell off cliffs, people whose remains were found, people who were located alive, people who died of exposure and were recovered. These explained cases showed zero correlation with Bigfoot sightings. Zero. The sightings clustered exclusively around the unexplained disappearances, the ones where no trace was ever found. If my pattern were the product of confirmation bias, it would appear in both data sets. It appeared in only one. I also submitted my methodology to 2 additional statisticians over the years, both at state universities, both without telling them the nature of the data. Both confirmed the correlation was significant. One of them, a woman named Dr. Christine Hall at Oregon State, pushed further than Richard Wells had. She ran what's called a Granger causality test, a method for determining whether one time series is useful in forecasting another. Her finding was that the sighting data had predictive value for the disappearance data, meaning the sightings could be used with statistical reliability to forecast when and approximately where a disappearance would occur. She asked me what the data represented. I told her it was wildlife migration patterns correlated with weather events. She accepted that explanation, but she added a note to her analysis that I've never forgotten. The forecasting relationship suggests that whatever event A represents, it has access to information about event B that precedes observable indicators. In biological systems, this is sometimes seen in animal behavior preceding earthquakes or volcanic activity. The organisms detect precursor signals that our instruments miss. Whatever your wildlife is doing, it's responding to something real that we haven't identified yet. Precursor signals. That phrase became central to how I understood what was happening. These creatures weren't predicting the future. They were sensing something in the present that we couldn't detect. Some environmental variable, some physical phenomenon, some quality of a particular place at a particular time that told them something was about to happen. And they responded by going there, by patrolling, by trying in whatever way they could to keep people away from the danger zones. In 1992, I had a conversation that added an entirely new dimension to my understanding. I was attending a resource management conference in Boise when I struck up a conversation with a man named Joseph Clearwater. Joseph was a member of the Nez Perce tribe and worked as a cultural liaison between tribal authorities and the Forest Service. He was about my age, tall, soft-spoken, with the kind of steady, measuring gaze that suggested he was always evaluating whether you deserved what he was about to tell you. We were eating lunch on a bench outside the conference center when Joseph asked me, quite casually, if I'd ever experienced anything unusual in the backcountry. Something about the way he asked it told me this wasn't small talk. I gave him a careful, abbreviated version of what I'd experienced in the Elwha headwaters. The vocalizations, the tracks, the sense of organized presence. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. My grandmother's people called them the Watchers, he said. Not because they watch us, because they watch the places. They've been doing it longer than we've been here. The old stories say they were here before the first people came across the land bridge. They were already watching then. Watching for what? I asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment. There are places where the world is thin, where things slip through. My grandmother described it as a blanket with worn spots. Most of the time the blanket holds, but sometimes in certain places at certain times the fabric gets weak. Things push through from the other side, or things on this side fall through to there. The Watchers stand at those places. They guard the thin spots. When they fail, people go through. Go through to where? Grandmother said it wasn't a place. It was an in-between. Not here, not there, nowhere. She said the people who went through were still alive, still walking, still thinking they were on the trail. But the trail wasn't connected to anything anymore. It just went on and on and on. The hair on my arms rose. I thought of Kevin Clark's boot print, pointing forward mid-stride, going somewhere, going nowhere. Joseph told me more. He said the tribal oral histories stretching back generations described the Watchers as protectors, not of humans specifically, but of the integrity of the physical world. They patrolled boundaries that human beings couldn't perceive. The thin places shifted slowly over time, which is why the watchers were nomadic, why they moved through territories in patterns that seemed random but were actually responsive to the changing geography of vulnerability. When a thin place opened, the watchers converged on it. Their presence, their physical mass, their vocalizations. Joseph suggested these weren't just communication, they were containment. The sounds themselves, those low, resonant, subsonic tones, were part of how they held the boundaries in place. Think of it like singing to keep a roof from collapsing, Joseph said. The sound has weight, it has structure, it presses against the weakness and holds it closed. That's why you hear them before someone disappears. They're working, they're singing the world back together. And when it works, nobody notices, nobody disappears. Nobody even knows they were in danger. When it doesn't work, he trailed off. Someone walks through, I finished. And the watchers grieve, Joseph said. The stories say you can hear it. After someone is lost, the sounds change. Longer, lower. My grandmother said it was the saddest sound on earth, a watcher mourning a failure. I sat on that bench in Boise and felt the architecture of my understanding shift like tectonic plates. 3 decades of data, statistics, maps, field notes, all of it suddenly had a framework that made it coherent. Not a scientific framework, not one I could publish or present at a conference, but a framework that explained every anomaly, every correlation, every impossible circle in a meadow floor. The creatures weren't associated with the disappearances because they caused them. They were associated because they were the only force standing between those disappearances and a much, much higher number of victims. The sightings that preceded vanishings weren't warnings of what was to come. They were evidence of a defense that almost held, but didn't quite. And the government's response, the sealed files, the confiscated evidence, the transferred personnel, the mysterious Dr. Cole, all of that made sense too, not as conspiracy, as containment of a different kind. If the public understood that there were places in the American wilderness where the physical world became unreliable, where a person could step off a trail and step out of existence, the panic alone would be catastrophic. Better to file the reports quietly, better to let the missing stay unexplained. Better to let the Bigfoot sightings remain the province of tabloids and entertainment shows, and never, ever allow them to be connected to the pattern they actually represented. After Boise, I spent the next 6 years doing the most careful work of my career. I expanded my dataset. I corresponded with Tom Green and 5 other rangers who had joined what we privately called the network. We pooled our data, standardized our methodology, and built a comprehensive map of every thin place disappearance we could document between 1953 and 1998. The total was 91 cases, 91 people who vanished without any physical trace in the wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, and Northern California over a 45-year period. Every single case was preceded by a cluster of Bigfoot sightings in the immediate area. Every single case occurred in a gap between sighting clusters, during a window when the patrol was absent or diminished. And in 14 of those cases, searchers after the fact found the circles, perfect geometric absences in vegetation and soil, ranging from 12 to 37 feet in diameter, always within a mile of the point of last known contact with the missing person. I retired from the Park Service in May of 2002. I was 63 years old, and my knees told me every morning that the backcountry was finished with me even if I wasn't finished with it. Carol threw me a party. My son came up from California with his wife and my 2 grandchildren. We ate cake and people said nice things about my service, and I smiled and thanked everyone. And then I went home and sat in the garage with my lockbox and cried for the first time since my father died in 1974. I cried because of what I knew and couldn't share. I cried because 91 families were still waiting for answers that the system would never provide. I cried because somewhere in those forests, those enormous, gentle, impossible beings were still walking their patrols, still singing their low songs against the weakness in the world, and still sometimes failing and still grieving when they did. But retirement gave me something that active service never had: time. Time and freedom, and a computer that my daughter-in-law kept upgrading whether I asked her to or not. In 2003, I began digitizing everything, every case, every map, every statistical analysis. I built a database on that computer, crude by modern standards but functional, and for the first time I could search my data and cross-reference it and look for sub-patterns within the larger pattern. What I found was that the disappearances weren't random in time. They clustered, not around seasons, which is what I'd originally expected, but around years. There were peak years and quiet years, and the peak years corresponded to something I hadn't been tracking: geomagnetic activity, solar cycles, fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. I discovered this by accident. I was reading an article in a science magazine about how some animals navigate using magnetic fields, birds, sea turtles, certain types of bacteria, and how disruptions in those fields during solar storms could cause navigation errors. And something clicked. I went to NASA's publicly available data on solar activity and overlaid it against my disappearance timeline. The peak disappearance years: 1967, 1971, 1979, 1982, 1989, 1991, every one of them fell within 12 months of a solar maximum, the peak of the 11-year solar cycle when geomagnetic activity is highest. The quiet years fell during solar minimums. The correlation was 0.89, not as tight as the sighting to disappearance correlation, but statistically significant beyond reasonable doubt. If the thin places were related to magnetic field fluctuations, it would explain why they shifted over time. It would explain why the watchers were nomadic, tracking disturbances that moved with geomagnetic changes. It would explain the seasonal variation within peak years, with most disappearances occurring in late summer when the Earth's axial tilt places the northern hemisphere in maximum exposure to solar wind. And it would explain the circles. If the thin places were essentially magnetic anomalies, points where the field weakened enough to allow some kind of spatial disruption, the perfect geometric shape of the circles would be consistent with the cylindrical geometry of a magnetic field line intersecting a plane surface. I'm not a physicist. I want to be clear about that. I'm a forester and a ranger with 41 years of watching and documenting and correlating. But the magnetic hypothesis explained more of my data than any other framework I'd encountered. And it aligned with Joseph Clearwater's description of the thin places in ways that made me wonder how much his grandmother's people had understood through centuries of observation that our science was only beginning to approach. In 2005, I made a decision that I'd been avoiding for years. I drove down to the Nez Perce Reservation and asked to speak with Joseph again. He was retired himself by then, living in a small house near Lapwai with a garden that his granddaughter helped him maintain. He welcomed me like an old friend, though we'd only met the once, and we sat on his porch drinking coffee while his dog, a half-blind Australian shepherd named Captain, dozed at our feet. I told Joseph everything: the full data set, the statistical analyses, the network of rangers, the circles, the magnetic correlation. He listened to all of it with that same measured patience, and when I finished, he said something that shook me to my foundation. "You're the first one who put numbers to it, but my people have known the cycle for a long time. We didn't call it solar maximum. We called it the restless sky. The elders tracked it by watching the aurora, when the northern lights came further south than usual, when they were visible from places where they normally weren't. The elders would send runners to the known thin places. The runners would build fires and sing and make noise, keep people away. The same thing the watchers do, just on a human scale. Did it work? I asked. Better than doing nothing. Not as well as the watchers. The watchers can feel the field. They know where the weakness is forming before it opens. We could only guess based on history. But yes, it worked. My grandmother remembered a season when she was young, probably around 1920, when the aurora was visible as far south as the Salmon River. The elders sent out runners, and that year, nobody was lost. The runners heard the watchers in the forests around the thin places, singing, working. My grandmother said the runners sang with them, different songs but the same purpose. She said the watchers came closer that year than any other time in memory, close enough that several of the runners saw them clearly in daylight. She said they looked tired. Tired. That word has stayed with me longer than any other detail in this entire 60-plus year investigation. The image of those massive beings, those ancient guardians, walking their endless patrols along boundaries that human beings can't perceive, singing the world together in a language we can barely hear, failing sometimes, grieving always, and looking tired. They've been doing this since before we were here, before the Nez Perce, before any human being set foot on this continent, standing watch at the thin places, holding the fabric together, and we, in our extraordinary human capacity for willful ignorance, have spent the last century ridiculing their existence, filing their evidence in sealed cabinets, and leaving them to carry on alone. After my visit with Joseph, I spent the next 3 years writing everything down. Not for publication. I had no illusions about being taken seriously by any institution capable of acting on this information. I wrote it down because 91 families deserved a record, because the data deserved to exist in a form more durable than boxes in a garage, and because I was closing in on 70 years old, and I could feel the years in my joints and my lungs, and I wanted the knowledge to survive me. I completed the document in 2008, 312 pages, every case, every correlation, every statistical analysis, maps, photographs, Dr. Christine Hall's Granger causality test, Joseph Clearwater's oral history, Tom Green's circle documentation, all of it organized chronologically and cross-referenced 6 different ways. Writing that document was the hardest thing I've done in my life, and I include 41 years of backcountry rescue operations in that statement. Every case meant revisiting a family. Every name was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's partner. Mike Stanton, the 19-year-old trail crew volunteer from '82. His mother wrote to the Park Service every year on the anniversary of his disappearance until 2004, and 22 letters. I know because I received copies of every one through a contact at the regional office. She never stopped asking. She never accepted that her boy was simply gone. In her last letter, she was 79 years old and still writing in a hand that had gone shaky with age, but never lost its determination. "Someone knows what happened to my Michael," she wrote, "and someday the truth will come out." She was right. Someone did know, I knew, Tom knew, the network knew, and we couldn't tell her because the truth was so far outside the bounds of acceptable reality that sharing it would have caused her more pain than the mystery. How do you tell a mother that her son didn't die, not in any way she could understand, but that he walked through a hole in the physical world that shouldn't exist and that no human technology can detect or retrieve him from? How is that comfort? How is that closure? I wrestled with that question for every one of those 91 cases, and I never found a satisfactory answer. The best I could manage was documentation, rigorous, meticulous, defensible documentation that would exist after I was gone and that would, eventually, reach someone capable of doing what I could not. I made 12 copies, I sent them to each member of the network, with instructions to keep them safe and to pass them to someone trusted if anything happened to them. Then something remarkable happened. Tom Green called me in the spring of 2009, and for the first time in the decades I'd known him, he sounded happy. "Dale," he said, "I just got off the phone with a woman in British Columbia. She's been tracking the same pattern. From the Canadian side, she has data going back to 1958. And Dale, she has something we don't. She has audio recordings." Her name was Dr. Angela Martin. She was a retired wildlife biologist from the University of British Columbia who had spent her career studying bear behavior in the coastal ranges of British Columbia. In the process, she had captured thousands of hours of audio on remote recording equipment deployed in bear habitat. Starting in the early 1980s, her recordings had been picking up the vocalizations, the same structured, low-frequency, complex tonal patterns that I'd heard in the Elwha headwaters in '85. Angela had 47 recordings from 23 different locations over a 17-year period, but Angela had done something we hadn't. She'd had the recordings analyzed by a colleague in the university's linguistics department, not bioacoustics, linguistics. The colleague, a professor who specialized in comparative language systems and who insisted on remaining anonymous, spent 8 months with the recordings. His analysis found that the vocalizations exhibited structural features consistent with language, not human language, not any known animal communication system, but a system with syntax, with recurring elements that functioned like grammar, with what appeared to be referential content, sounds that corresponded consistently to specific environmental features. A particular tone pattern appeared repeatedly in recordings made near water. A different pattern appeared in recordings from ridgelines. A third appeared exclusively in recordings made during periods of high geomagnetic activity. There were patterns that seemed to function as identifiers, individual specific sound signatures that appeared at the beginning of vocal exchanges, almost like names. And there were patterns that the linguist described as emotional modifiers, tonal variations that altered the apparent meaning of other sounds, the same way that inflection changes meaning in human speech. The most striking finding was what the linguist called turn-taking protocol. The vocalizations followed conversational rules. One voice would produce a pattern, pause, and then another voice would respond with a related but different pattern. Interruptions were rare. When they occurred, the interrupted voice would stop and wait. This is not behavior consistent with animal territory calls or mating displays. This is behavior consistent with discussion, with the structured exchange of complex information between individuals who understand and respect the communicative process. The watchers were not just communicating. They were describing their environment in a structured vocal system, complex enough to be classified as proto-language at minimum, and possibly as a fully developed non-human language. They were talking about the thin places. They were talking about the field. They were reporting to each other on the state of the boundaries they guarded. Angela joined the network. Our group now spanned from Northern California to the Yukon. Our combined data set included over 130 cases, 6 decades of documentation, and the first physical evidence that the watchers possessed language. We were, collectively, sitting on what I believe to be the most significant body of evidence regarding an undocumented intelligent species in human history. And not one of us could publish it without destroying our reputations and potentially our livelihoods. I'm 86 years old now. Carol passed in 2018. Tom Green died in 2021, peacefully, in his sleep, in Kalispell, Montana, with his maps on the wall of his bedroom. Joseph Clearwater is still alive, last I heard, though we've lost touch in recent years. Angela Martin is 88 and still sharp and still listening to her recordings. The network still exists, though its composition has changed. Younger members now, people who found us through careful, quiet inquiries. Some of them are tech-savvy in ways that make my computer skills look like cave painting. They're digitizing everything, cross-referencing with satellite data and magnetometer readings and seismograph records and atmospheric sensors. The pattern holds. It always holds. And the disappearances continue. The most recent one I'm aware of that fits the pattern was in 2023. A man in his 50s, experienced hiker, vanished in a wilderness area in Washington state. His gear was found. His body was not. Trail cameras in the area captured in the 72 hours before his disappearance multiple frames showing large, dark, bipedal figures moving through the forest at night. The watchers were there. They were patrolling. They were singing. And they couldn't hold it. I don't know what the thin places are. I don't know where the people go. I don't know why the magnetic field creates these vulnerabilities, or what exists on the other side of the boundary that the watchers guard. I've spent 60 years accumulating data, and the honest truth is that the data tells me what happens, not why. But I know this. In every forest where I've worked, in every wilderness area where the network has eyes and ears, there are beings of enormous size and remarkable intelligence walking paths that human beings can't see, guarding boundaries that human science hasn't detected, and carrying a burden that we haven't had the decency to acknowledge, much less share. The Bigfoot sightings that precede disappearances aren't omens. They aren't threats. They aren't predatory behavior. They are the visible edge of a guardianship so old and so vast that our entire recorded history is just a small recent chapter in their story. When you hear about a sighting in a remote forest, what you're hearing about is a sentinel on duty. When that sighting clusters with others in the same area, what you're seeing is a mobilization. And when someone goes missing in the gaps between those clusters, what's happened isn't that the watchers took someone, it's that the watchers lost someone they were trying to save. I want you to sit with that. I want you to sit with it the way I've sat with it for 6 decades. The government knows. They've known since at least the early 1980s and probably longer. They know about the thin places. They know about the watchers. They know about the magnetic correlation. And they have made a calculated decision that the public is better served by ignorance than by truth. Maybe they're right. Maybe the knowledge that certain places in the American wilderness can simply erase a human being from existence would cause panic that outweighs the benefit of awareness. Maybe telling people that there are 8-foot-tall beings walking the forests like guardian monks would cause exactly the kind of rush of seekers and hunters and cameras and noise that would disrupt the very work the watchers are doing. But 91 families, at minimum 91 families in my dataset alone, have spent years and decades waiting for answers about loved ones who walked into the woods and never came back. Those families deserve to know that their people didn't suffer. They didn't fall off a cliff and lie broken at the bottom. They didn't starve to death lost in the brush. They stepped through a place where the world was thin, and they kept walking, and whatever is on the other side of that threshold, the expressions on the faces of the watchers who failed to prevent it, suggest it isn't a violent end. It's a departure, a transition into an in-between that Joseph's grandmother described as walking a trail that goes on and on and on. I don't know if that's comfort. Some nights it is. Some nights it's the most terrifying thing I can imagine. An eternal walk down a trail that leads nowhere, with no way back, no end in sight, and no one to tell you that someone tried to stop it from happening, that something huge and ancient and weary stood at the boundary and sang with everything it had, and it wasn't enough. I've instructed the remaining members of the network to release the full document upon my death. The 12 copies are distributed. The digital versions are backed up in locations that I won't describe. The data will survive me, and it will reach people who have the resources and the courage to do something with it. In the meantime, if you hike in the backcountry of the Pacific Northwest, the northern Rockies, the coastal ranges of British Columbia, anywhere in that vast green corridor of ancient forest that runs from Northern California to Alaska, pay attention. Listen for the low sounds in the valley. Watch for movement at the edge of your vision. And if you feel that particular quality of silence, the one where the birds stop and the insects go quiet and the forest itself seems to be holding its breath, do not continue forward. Turn around. Walk back the way you came. Walk with purpose. Because that silence means the watchers are working, and it means the boundary is thin, and it means you are standing very, very close to a place where the world can fail. And if you see them, if you catch a glimpse of a dark, massive figure moving through the trees, know that you are not seeing a monster. You are seeing a guardian. You are seeing one of the oldest, most faithful, most exhausted protectors this planet has ever produced. And you are seeing it in the act of trying to save your life. They deserve better than ridicule. They deserve better than blurry photographs and punchlines and Halloween costumes. They deserve recognition for what they are, which is the last line of defense between us and a phenomenon we aren't equipped to survive. They've been holding that line since before we had the language to thank them for it. I'm Dale Whitfield. I was a ranger for 41 years. I watched the pattern form and hold for 6 decades. And I am telling you, with everything I have left, the Bigfoot sightings before disappearances are not coincidence. They are not predation. They are not correlation without causation. They are proof of something guarding us, something that has always guarded us, and something that is getting tired. Pay attention. The pattern is impossible to ignore, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Trust me on that. I've been trying for over 60 years.